Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore water and human destiny. With me is Stephen Schwartz, who is the publisher of the Schwartz Report, a daily internet newsletter that covers important trends that are affecting our lives. Stephen is the author of several books, including The Secret Vaults of Time, The Alexandria Project, Opening to the Infinite, and The 8 Laws of Change, How to Become an Agent for Personal and Social Transformation. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, water is sort of ubiquitous. We're made of water, and there's so much water on this planet. And to me, it was for a long time a mystery. Where did all this water come from? How did it get here? And I'm still a little puzzled. I gather the conventional explanation is it comes from comets that have crashed into the Earth eons ago.
That's one of the interpretations. I mean, the reality is, in an absolute way, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
What we do know is that water is destiny.
Yeah.
Water has always been a significant issue. I mean, just to give you one example, when we speak of someone as being a rival, this person is my rival for something.
Yes.
Well, that word comes from the Latin rivalis, and it means a person who shares the same water with another person.
Mm.
So the oldest, one of the oldest recorded conflicts between humans is a water war with the Sumerians in 6000 BCE. So water has always been a absolutely central issue in the well-being of any society and its people. About 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, but 97% of it is salt. Only 2% of it is fresh water, and about half of that comes from beneath the Earth's surface. So this issue about water is a huge problem, and it is becoming an even greater problem in the modern day because of sea rise and drought. I think we're going to have 3 major migrations in the United States and many more over. I mean, for instance, in China, about 2.5 billion people depend on the Himalayan hydrology, the glaciers up in the Himalayas.
The melting of the glaciers.
And as those, they depend on those glaciers.
Yeah.
And as those glaciers are melting, that 2.5 billion people are going to lose their water source.
But the melting also feeds the rivers, the
absolutely
Brahmaputra and the Ganges.
Well, okay, take the Brahmaputra. One of the great conflicts that is going on is who controls these rivers. And for instance, in Bangladesh, which is a very low-lying country, as the salt water from the sea floods in and not only submerges the land but pollutes with salt the fresh water that's available. Already today there are about 6,000 illegal immigrants a day crossing into India as a result of water.
Mm-hmm.
So much of the Middle East, for instance, the wars in the Middle East that the media never talks about this, but they're water wars. The argument between Jordan and Lebanon and Egypt and Israel and the Palestinians is that who controls the water?
The Jordan River.
Well, yes, and I mean desalinization, but who gets access to the water?
Yeah.
If you look at the United States, we're talking about 52% of the American population lives within 200 miles of a seacoast, most of it right on the seacoast, less than 30 feet of elevation, and already you can begin to see. You go to a city like Florida, or a state like Florida, even though the state government may have no belief in climate change, at the federal and state level, you can, as a legislator, you can bloviate away about whether climate change is real or not. But if you're a mayor, you got to actually govern, because people call you up in the middle of the night and say the sewers are flooding. You got to deal with that. Mm-hmm. And although there is a large segment of our federal government that at the legislative level and at the executive level, the president, who don't believe climate change exists, you talk to the mayor of Miami or Fort Myers, and they're talking about, how much of the city are we going to lose? I had a dinner one night with a city councilman from Norfolk who said to me, we figure we could lose 25 to 30% of the city as a result of sea rise. Imagine Washington, D.C. with the Lincoln Memorial as an island. Or imagine San Francisco as a series of islands, because those are the kind of projections. So we're going to see huge losses in real estate. Trillions of dollars of coastal real estate is going to become uninhabitable. Things like the eastern shore of Maryland or the Outer Banks of North Carolina, they're going to disappear.
And you're not even yet talking about pollution.
Oh, yes. This is just basically these three migrations are away from the coast because of sea rise, out of the southwest because there's not enough water. I mean, we're sitting here today in Las Vegas, and you look over at at Lake Mead. Mm-hmm. It's at the lowest depth it has ever been in recorded history
since the lake, which is an artificial lake, was created.
Yes,
that's true.
I mean, and
there are people in 5 states dependent on the water from that lake.
That's absolutely.
Las Vegas, we're adjacent to the lake, but we're one of the minor consumers of that water.
Yes. I mean, about 2/3 of the water is used for agriculture. Mm-hmm. About 40% of the world's produce is grown in on irrigated agricultural lands. Well, who controls that water? Will there be enough water? I was just looking at some figures. For instance, it takes 15 million pounds of water to grow a 2,000-pound cow. Not only for the cow, but the grass and, Mm-hmm. It takes 1,300 gallons of water to produce an 8-ounce hamburger. Well, you begin to realize that. You think the food that we eat, how much of it is absolutely at risk if there were alterations in the availability of water. And then, as you say, if you look at a state like West Virginia, where you have these coal dumps occurring, or North Carolina, where they have these coal waste ponds that are leaking into the water. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can remember when I first started doing research on water, which is some years ago, up in Ohio, one of the rivers would catch fire.
That's right.
There was so much petroleum leakage going into the water
right
that
through
it literally
downtown
caught fire.
Cleveland, as I recall.
Yes, exactly.
The Cuyahoga River.
Right. I mean, we've all seen on the television pictures of people with water coming out of their household taps, and they hold a lighter to it that bursts into flame. So. Yeah. The pollution issue is yet another level of water.
Well, even in the United States, which has probably a better water supply than many other countries, there are places where people aren't getting clean water. Flint, Michigan is only one of many.
Absolutely. I mean, what we're discovering, because we have not maintained our infrastructure properly, not only are our roads breaking down and our bridges collapsing, but our water systems, most of which were built Chicago or New York, some of them were built in the late 19th century and haven't really been upgraded properly since then, or they have become polluted, or there's lead in the pipes or in the solder that they use to put the pipes together. And
there are also antibiotics being
that's a whole
put into the water supply.
I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay, and as a result of chicken farming and the overuse of antibiotics with the chickens, because they keep them in such unnatural conditions, that then floods into the livers, that there's a whole tongue of the Chesapeake Bay that is essentially a dead zone as a result of that. Hormones, that's another one. The amount of hormones that are fed to industrially raised industrial animal husbandry and fowl husbandry that feed them these hormones that then go in, and then you discover that children have these elevated levels of hormones because of the tap water that they're drinking. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Water is destiny, and we as a country and the world as a proposition has simply not properly recognized and what is required to produce potable water.
We take it for granted.
Absolutely. Half of the hospital beds in the world today are occupied by people who have waterborne diseases. More children have died from diarrhea as a result of bad water.
Dysentery, basically.
Dysentery, yes, because of dysentery, than all of the people who died in all of the wars since the beginning of World War II. So about half of the human population today, as you and I are sitting here, have lower standards of sanitation than were enjoyed in the Roman Empire.
Well, is there a prospect for turning this around, or is it just going to, in your view, get worse?
Well,
once the seas rise, it's not going to be undone.
No, and actually we need to say one other thing that's important, as long as we're making this little list of calamities, and that's the privatization. Big list. That's the move to privatize water.
Oh yes.
I ran into a guy. I presented at a conference. I presented at a conference a paper about my water research at this big conference of water engineers, and a guy came up to me afterwards because I said some of the same things we've just discussed here, and he said, "I thought you were very amusing." And I said, "Well, why do you think that's amusing?" And he said, "Because for the last 15 years, I've been buying up water." I said, "What do you mean you've been buying up water?" He said, "Well, all over the United States, there are little streams, and I buy real estate. So I buy 5, 10, 15, 20 acres, 50 acres that have streams on them, and I own that water." And I said, "Well, you mean your idea is that you're going to capitalize on people's lack of water?" And he said, "Of course."
Well, bottled water has become a big industry, and not only that, a source of pollution with all the plastic bottles.
Absolutely. So what does the future look like? Well,
you pay more for a bottle of water today than people used to pay for beer or soft drinks in the past.
There are places where water is more expensive than gasoline. So, you say, well, what does the future hold? I don't think that's clear. You can make projections, but they all make assumptions about, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. I would say that you cannot answer the question until you can say, what water policies are we going to develop? Now, we're going to see these huge migrations. I think I just take that as a given now. Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque. Candidly, I would say to you that these cities in their present configuration are doomed. We're in the second decade of the 20th century as we're doing, 21st century as we're doing this interview. By the second decade of the 22nd century, I would project to you that Las Vegas will be approximately a third the size of what it is now, because there's just not enough water. and there's no other place to get water.
Yeah. Well, what you seem to be saying in a nutshell is that with regard to climate change, it's too late to reverse it. The best that we can do is begin to modify our behavior to adjust to the changes that are inevitable.
Well, it isn't me saying this. This is hundreds and hundreds of scientists. This is quite a large community of people who are all running around with their hair on fire saying, listen, everybody, you've got to pay attention to this.
Yeah.
Just because, it reminds me, we're like the little frog in the saucepan of water. You know that story?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You put the frog in the saucepan, you turn the fire on. Well, at first it's just kind of warm, and that's really sort of nice. And well, then it gets hot, and eventually the frog gets cooked. Because it's by the time he figures out he needs to jump, it's too late. Mm-hmm. And so I would say to you, based on the social policies that I see implemented at this time, and that I see in the foreseeable future, particularly given that a very large percentage of our legislators and in the people in the executive branch proclaim their not only their uninterest in climate change, but their conviction that climate change is, even if it's happening, it has nothing to do with human activity. And so I would say to you, I'm not very sanguine about the future in that respect, because I think we're going to see massive dislocations of people. I think we're going to see huge economic crises as a result of the collapse of coastal real estate. I think cities are now, I'm now beginning, I'll tell you the difference, Jeff. This has really startled me. I've been doing this. I wrote my first paper on climate change in 1991. I read a paper. What got me started was I read a paper in the American Scientist about ice coring and CO2 levels. And that's what really got me started in this. And so shortly thereafter, I wrote a first paper. When I now look at the two constants that I see in climate change over the years that I've been doing this, which is now several decades, is that it's happening faster. It always is happening faster than we thought it was going to. The timeline is collapsing, and the social and the effects of the collapse of the timeline are worse and greater than we had anticipated.
And it seems as if there's no political will from any political party to really address the problem.
That's right. And there are very strong private sector interests in not addressing the problem. My personal view is the function of the state should be to produce well-being. Presently, the major social priority of the United States and many other countries is to produce an environment for maximum profit-taking. And I think that is disastrous.
Or to put maybe a softer face on it, more jobs.
That's the way it gets rationalized.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the only social priority we have here in the United States today is to create an environment for maximum profit. And I think that the function of the state should be to produce well-being. And in fact, when you look at countries where well-being is a priority, you see much happier, healthier, longer living people than you do in countries like our own. So are we going to be able to navigate this? Well, some group of us will, but I think we need to be prepared. This is going to kill more people than any war.
Enormous dislocation. There will be millions and millions of people maybe who once had luxury homes who will become homeless.
Yes. Well, we already know. I just checked this, in fact, before we did this interview. There are now 35 million people who are designated as climate refugees. 35 million. As a result of some kind of disorder, which at its root, it's, as I say, it's like looking at the Middle East. we talk about the Middle East as basically a war between religious groups or political groups, but when you get down to the lick log, as they say where I come from, what you're really talking about is water wars.
Mm-hmm. For example, in Syria, I have heard that that's the case.
Absolutely. I do the Schwartz report, and then I write this column for Explore. And I got a email not very long ago from a Jordanian geophysicist who said to me, I read something I had written about water, and I just want you to know we are now taking in thousands of these refugees as a result of the Syrian and other disorders. We have reached a point in water where there is not enough water to service all the mosques. Part of the Islamic religious ceremony.
Before you enter.
Yes, in Islam, before you go into the mosque to participate in the rites of the faith, you wash yourself under your arms. I mean, you have a whole process. Rinse your mouth. They don't have enough water. This is what he wrote me. We don't have enough water to service the mosques, and so that's creating enormous cultural stress on people who cannot observe their faith because they don't have enough water. So I think in ways great and small that we are only beginning to recognize. Oh, and the point that I started to make and then didn't do it, this big change that has come up recently, just in the last, 6 to 8 months, that has really, I find myself being particularly alarmed, is you now have city governments that are talking about planning retreat. Now think about that for a minute. You've got these cities where millions of people live, where the city government is now talking in its departments amongst itself. How are we going to retreat as the water rises? How are we going to move? What's going to happen to those office buildings where thousands of people work? What's going to happen to that coastal residential real estate? What's going to happen to our harbor facilities? I live in Seattle, for instance, and we have a whole harbor facility, this low-lying land. Or you go to Norfolk, Virginia, where the world's largest naval installations are, and you realize so much of the economy is dependent not so much on the drinking of the water, but on ships coming in with goods, ships going out with goods. You look up in New York and Philadelphia. What happens to those huge commercial coastal port facilities? All of those containers and cranes and all the people that support all of that. And
I think you told me recently that the Navy has already spent billions of dollars raising the piers.
Yes, and they've spent, and they realize they aren't raising them enough. So I would say to you, there are people who will listen to this video, who will live to see these changes that we're talking about by the end of this century, and there are people listening who will live that long. We are going to live and need to begin to plan to live in a country which is organized very differently. It's not only a matter, we have to quit doing carbon, we need to convert from carbon to non-carbon energy sources, because the burning of the petroleum and coal is what's causing the CO2 levels to rise. The CO2 levels rising are causing the warming of the planet. The warming of the planet is the melting of the ice. I mean, just as a geopolitical issue, if you look at the map of the United States, and you see where the Arctic sea ice is, as this ice is melting, I live on a little island off the coast of Washington. We are experiencing, in North Island, 2 islands, North Island, we are experiencing significant problems of noise because as the ice melts, it became clear to the defense planners that the northwestern coast of the United States was suddenly vulnerable because areas that were formerly icebound will now be capable of putting warships and submarines with missiles and all that sort of thing. And so there needs to be some defensive
You're talking about the Russians.
Well, or the Chinese, or who knows. But anyway, you're a geopolitical military planner, and you're looking at that, and it's like you've got a whole flank that's exposed. And so they're moving the growlers, this particular kind of aircraft, which are incredibly noisy, and they're on these isolated San Juan Islands off of the coast of Washington. The decibel level is now up to 130 decibels when they're flying, and 130 decibels produces health effects.
Yeah.
So this is not, when we think about water, we can't just think, oh, I'm talking about water. I mean, drinking water. That is an issue, a big issue. And we can't just think about sea rise. Water touches every aspect of human culture. And as the water issues arise, water is destiny.
I know I've seen a television special in India where the population has grown so great the water table has dropped enormously just to provide drinking water for the people. It's gotten to the point where water has to be shipped in by truck to certain locations. The water table is just gone.
Well, as I say, 2.5 billion of the Earth's 7 billion people are dependent on the Himalayan hydrology. And, or you look in the Middle East, 5% of the world's population only has access to 1% of the world's water. And so where you have these large civilizations that are going to be profoundly impacted by the lack of water, 2.5 billion people are not going to all just lie down and die. They're going to migrate. And as that migration occurs, think of the social disruption that will occur as hundreds of thousands of people move from one place to another. The dislocation, we look at what's happening as a result of, for instance, the current war that's going on in Syria, and look at the impact on Germany as an example, or the whole argument about immigration and nativism that has arisen politically. All of that is being driven by these dislocations. And when you realize that the water dislocations are going to produce millions and millions of people moving, what effect is that going to have? What wars will occur? What diseases will occur? What social dislocations? What economic dislocations? Water is destiny.
Well, Stephen Schwartz, this has been an eye-opener. It's not easy to confront these unpleasant facts, but it's important that people do.
Essential.
So thank you very much for being with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.